Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGamerTech.com video we have some further news regarding backwards compatibility, most specifically of Xbox Live Arcade games, as well as some other bits and pieces as well. This information comes to us from a Microsoft Game Studios VP, Phil Spencer, and he was talking in an interview, and basically has advised that if you want to still play your Xbox Live Arcade games that of course you've been playing on your Xbox 360, you'll need to keep the original console that you own. He even said, and I quote, those games will continue to run on your Xbox 360 for as long as your Xbox 360 runs. The box is not backwards compatible, and we think for somebody who invests in a large digital library that you will want to keep your Xbox 360. He further illustrated that your identity on Xbox One and Xbox 360 will coexist. In other words, it will be a symbiotic relationship. You will not lose your identity. And he did so via this quote: "You don't have a separate identity on the Xbox One or Xbox 360. It's the same. You are you. My friend's network is the same on both boxes. My achievements are the same. So we think that our service component is an important component to keep constant across both devices." Once again, they also whacked lyrically about, well, the cloud, and it stated that Xbox One is architected to take full advantage of state-of-the-art processors and infinite power of the cloud. End quote. So I think there's a few things before we move on to the remainder of the news. The first thing is this is not really that surprising. It's not to say that they couldn't make Xbox Live Arcade games work. Some of them obviously they could fairly easily, but they would require some restructuring, and they would actually require an emulator because obviously the two processors are very different. You're looking at an x64/86 processor compared to a PowerPC architecture of the Xbox 360, and it would just be a complete mess. Plus as well, the Xbox 360 CPU is pretty grunty. It's got quite a lot of power in it, and for the Xbox One's CPU to be able to actually emulate that in a decent fashion across all arcade games, it's just messy, so it's not very surprising given their stance on other games. Don't forget, some arcade games are pretty impressive graphically. For example, let's say Alan Wake American Nightmares is pretty damn nice. It's basically using the full engine of the normal arcade game. So I don't think any of this is really a surprise. I think the comments are more just to enforce the fact that they believe, Microsoft of course, that, well, the systems are going to coexist for quite some time. In regards to the cloud situation, I'm going to be producing a video most likely tomorrow. I know I've been saying that for a couple of days. It's just been pretty chaotic for me over the last, let's say, week. But fortunately I have now just over a week off work, so I'm going to be catching up on stuff. Obviously YouTube is going to be making some changes as well, so I'm doing some planning on new banners, website move as well, but it should all be done over the next couple of days, including the kill zone analysis for the lighting that I've been promising you guys for a while now. Anyway, there has been some other news in regards to comments on the always connected and always on DRM. However, it's one of those answers where it's a very politician answer, and no offense to any politicians who are listening, but you know what I mean by the term. In other words, it's an answer that's very long-winded, but it doesn't really answer the question. Anyway, I'll read out the quote to you guys. The question originally was, is there any kind of DRM or anything that's happening where you're prevented from playing a game, a single player even maybe, if you're offline? Now the answer was, and this is a fairly long-winded one, and I quote, "So one of the advantages in the Xbox One generation, the reason we're looking at installing and understanding which games are yours and your own, is the ability for your games to roam with you, and you can go to an Xbox, you can go to a box, and that box knows which games you have, and you can take those games with you and move around. I think that's a real strong component of the platform, and it obviously requires some local version of the game because you don't have to carry your discs around with you, as long as you're kind of bringing your content with you. So I think it's going to unlock a lot of capability for the gamer, much like they walk around with the gamer score and the live ID." End quote. You see what I mean about that? Doesn't really answer the question there. There's a couple of problems I have with this right off the bat. First of all, I could take my games with me now. Okay? If I have a game in a case, I am taking that game with me. If I take Street Fighter 4, just for example, I don't know why I use that example, but it works. I put that game in a case so it doesn't get damaged, of course, that's the key, and I take it around, my friend Tom's house. I don't have a friend called Tom, but let's just assume I did for the purpose, actually I do, kind of. And I take it around his house, and, I put it into his console. Lo and behold, the magic of being able to take my game with me. It's not that impressive. And I can understand some benefits of this on a somewhat less sarcastic way. Sure, in some respects it's fantastic because that means I don't have to worry about taking my entire collection around to, Tom's house. But, okay, realistically, I'm still going to want to ideally take the disc with me because let's assume, just for a moment, that Tom has an average internet connection, by which I'm not talking a god-awful connection where if you want to download, a JPEG, you're spending pretty much the time it takes to boil a kettle. We're talking an average connection, 20 to 40 megabytes kind of connection, which I think for most areas now is what I'd consider the median. It's by no means the fastest, but it's by no means the slowest. Right now, game installs on PC are anything from 4 to 12 gigs. Okay, we can pretty much ascertain that the average install for the Xbox One is certainly going to be larger than that. Let's say the average is, let's just say 8 gigs for the purposes of argument. The thing is, if I take that game around to Tom's house via a disc, I don't have any benefit of this system. If, on the other hand, I don't have to take the game to Tom's house, and I do it via the internet, or I could do it via the internet if I choose, whichever way you want to look at it. Now I have to download the entire thing. So it's not like I can just, let's say, play the thing. Now, obviously, in regards to the PlayStation 4, there is the streaming. So let's assume it works similar to the PlayStation 4 idea, where part of the data downloads, and then you can play the game as it's downloading. That would be cool, and that would be less of a big deal. The key factor is, though, I'm still needing to download a portion of the game, whether it's 500 megabytes or whether it's 2 gigs to start off with, and that hasn't been confirmed with the Xbox One. So, once again, this is one of those answers where they're trying to convince us of something that's a benefit, but I don't really see it. I understand that they're saying that we can take all this stuff with us, but I can do that anyway. I can just take the discs. Admittedly, if you have a particular game and you forget to take that game with you, I'm sure we've all done this. We've all left for someone's house and the game has been left in your console. You've taken the case with you, but, you've forgotten the game. I've done that a couple of times and you just feel like a right twit because you're telling them, oh my god, this game is so awesome. And then you get there. Well, I've forgotten the disc, but you can look at the screenshots and you can see what I mean about how awesome it is from the cover art. It doesn't quite have the same impact. So I'm sure we've all done that, but come on now. It's one of those things where the person's trying to convince you it's a benefit and it just doesn't work. I'm not saying that they won't have a good system. I'm not saying that it won't have benefits. Obviously it will. There are benefits of having your games on the system. One of them, of course, is simply that the games just don't get damaged, don't get scratched. You can't, for example, lose the game and all of that stuff. But this is one of those interview answers that it's just fairly weak. But anyway, those are just my opinions, of course. Other people might absolutely love this type of idea. For me, it just doesn't really do anything for me. It's not a massive negative. I mean, I've got a ridiculously fast, pretty damn fast connection anyway. I'm on 120 MB, and it's going up to 200. But even so, I still would rather just be able to put the disc in and play instantly if my friend brought a game round. I'd rather still not download anything initially, but that's just my personal opinion, of course. And that's what you're kind of here for. So what else is there? Yes, this is a pretty good question about the hard drive. The question was, and I quote, given that all the games need to be installed, that, off quote for a second, that has been confirmed. Back into quote again, is a 500GB hard drive, that doesn't seem very big. I'm assuming some of the games are going to be pretty huge now coming on Blu-ray, and this is the response. We did a lot of testing. We looked at the content that's being created today and what our roadmap looked like in terms of content creation. One thing I'd say about content today is you see content being delivered at many different levels. You have big disc-based games that come out, but you also see games that start more service-related, where they come out small and grow as the person builds their experience. And math says that 500GB of space is a lot of storage for the gamer in terms of now how much local gamer content they will save. Obviously the game is yours, so if you want to delete something off your hard drive, you could always reinstall something if you ran out of a situation where you're running out of space. But our math, when we look at the number of games that somebody usually owns and the content they consume, we think the hard drive will be a nice big hard drive for people. And that will be end quote. This somewhat ties into the previous question. Now, obviously Sony have not confirmed the size of their hard drive, and I wouldn't be surprised if it is around the 500GB mark. Now, there are two things about hard drives. The first is the size, and we'll go into that in a moment. The second is the speed. Now, as far as I'm aware, I have done some searching around and I've not found anything. No doubt one of you viewers/readers/whatever will automatically prove me wrong 2 minutes after I put the video up and point me to a link where it's actually giving me the details. But as far as I understand it, we don't really have that many details on the hard drive. I believe it's a 7200 RPM, but other than that, we don't have that many details on it. But obviously, speed is one of the big issues of the hard drive. But the other one is, well, size. Now, I don't really see how a 500GB hard drive is what I would consider that spacious. Now, obviously, game installs vary. Smaller games, for example, arcade games, for example, games like Limbo, are going to be small. There's no getting around it. There could be a couple of megabytes, in some cases by a couple, 20, 30 megabytes, to a couple of 100 megabytes. Fairly piddly. In other words, something that even a small USB stick can easily handle. On the other hand, because next generation textures are going to be huge, well, yeah, those games could get pretty big. Obviously, we don't exactly know how big the content's going to be, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're looking at 12 gigs plus in some games, especially on PC. For example, and I use PC not as a, comparison exactly of specifications or anything. It's just because obviously PCs have had higher resolution textures than consoles, we can at least use that as a base of how big one is versus another. And quite often you get game installs from between 8 gigs on PC all the way up to 20 in some really unusual, but still does happen. And this is probably going to become bigger because obviously game worlds are going to become larger. Game worlds are going to become a lot more complicated. You also got to take into account DLC, which I'm not in this particular instance. I'm just talking about a base install of a game. But when you start talking about DLC, you're talking about map packs, everything else. And don't forget other things, such as, aren't you supposed to be able to record live TV on this? Now, we're not really sure, of course, what the file sizes here are looking like, what type of compression they're using, just how well they're compressing the data. But even so, and I'm even assuming that you'll be able to rent movies or buy movies, maybe even install it onto the hard drive. And what about if it's a family system? Like, okay, 500 gigabytes might be fine for you. In other words, there's only one person that uses the Xbox One. But let's say it's, 2 or 3 kids that use it. Or let's say it's in the family room. So you've got, the parents who are using it for gaming and for TV. They've got their children who are using it for games, of course, and maybe a little bit of TV. Music, of course, also takes up space depending on the bit rate of the song, and so on and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, you could do a really crappy math. Like, we could say something like, you own 50 games, each game install is 10 gigs, therefore you've used up all of the space. But obviously, in reality, this doesn't really work. Also, 50 games, to me, isn't really that many. What? I hear you scream 50 games? That's a lot. Well, think about how many that is in reality over the course of owning a system for a couple of years. Especially if there's 2 or 3 people who are using that system. For example, I've known brothers when they were growing up, and they were both buying completely different games all the time. And so their collection would be massive. Even my own collection is huge. Like, my Steam account collection is, well, let's go with gargantuan. I don't know how many games I've got exactly. I lost count after I got to about 120 or something obscene. And certainly I've got similar amounts on... I've had similar amounts on Xbox and PlayStation. You just collect them, especially if the games are going cheap, like on sales, that type of thing. And once again, this is assuming that each game is only 10 gigs. This is assuming that we have no other content. This is assuming we're not recording live TV. This is assuming that we're not downloading map packs on games. This is assuming that I am the only one in the house that is playing on this Xbox One. So I don't really know how I feel about the 500GB hard drive. I would have liked to have seen it upgradable easily. I have feelings as to why it's not upgradable. My feelings, if I had to be honest, and I'm probably going to talk about this more in a different video because I don't want this one to get too off topic because this is mostly about the interview, but I have a feeling that it's mostly to do with the fact that there's certain system files on the hard drive, and that's another point. I would like to know just how much of the hard drive is partitioned to be usable. So in other words, is it a case where like 5 or 10 gigs of this has been used for the operating system? We don't really know that yet. Is it 500 gigabytes is available to the user? Is it, 487 gigs is available to the user? Well, it's probably going to be about that anyway because of the way that bytes are calculated on a hard disk. So it's probably not going to be 500 gigabytes exactly. It's probably going to be like, 487 or something like that. I'm not going to bother to do the calculation. But let's assume that, you've got 10 gigs that's available for operating system stuff. It could be more, it could be less, who knows. I'd like them to clarify the stuff. My gut feeling, however, is they don't want this to be readily accessible because I have a feeling they have certain operating system files on there and so on that are, well, most likely to avoid their system being hacked to buggery. I'll just put it that way and leave it for this particular video. But is there any other points we should look at? They did state, by the way, I don't think this is particularly that much news, but they did state that the Xbox One will only work when the Kinect is attached. I think the other one that I'll close the video out on, and this has been something that a few people have actually commented to me. Indeed, I actually have a friend, and he was talking to me about the Xbox One, and he's kind of 50-50 on whether he's going to get it. He said he's liking the PlayStation 4 more, but he said he was speaking to some other friends on the Xbox One, and they've said categorically that they're very nervous about the data that the Kinect is going to be sharing, and they said that they most likely are not going to get the Xbox One simply because they feel that the privacy issues with the Xbox One and the Kinect especially, because I even told you about the visual DRM. I made a video on visual DRM the other day, and obviously that stuff isn't confirmed for the system. In other words, I have the patents, but there's a difference between filing a patent and using the patent. I think this is one of the things that we really, as a community, I'm talking about gaming community, we really need to understand, because sometimes we get these rumors or speculation. It's not that the rumor itself at the time was wrong. It's just that, well, we assume. In other words, just because they file a patent, it doesn't necessarily mean that the patent is going to be used. It's like if I drive down a road that, say heads to, just for example, London in my case. well, okay, I could well be going to London. If you saw that I was turning onto that road, you could assume I was going to London. But in actuality, I could turn off to a side road and go a completely different direction, like 2 minutes before I get to the junction to London, if that makes any sense. Anyway, that's a really bad example, but still. But they did touch on the privacy issues of Kinect, and it's actually a fairly interesting answer, and I'll go ahead and read it out. The question was, it seems like the kind of data that could be theoretically collected and then used to influence future developers for a sequel or something. Poorly worded, but regardless. Now the answer is, and I quote, "I won't just focus on Kinect because I think about how fast somebody gets in a game, where the pinch points are. Where do people fail? All of those analytic capabilities are really important to us in designing future iterations of games and finding out what people love. That capability to the developer is really important as they try to get better at their craft and make better experience. But we obviously want to put the gamer in control of what data gets shared." End quote. This is a very, very interesting answer. You could take this a couple of ways, actually. But the biggest one here is they're not focused on Kinect, okay? Theoretically, and let's just go with a really Big Brother theory, conspiracy theory hack kind of idea here. Theoretically, they could measure your heartbeat. We know that Kinect can do this, and they could say, okay, he's playing a horror game, or she's playing a horror game. I see that their pulse rate is raising. Oh, okay. They fought the boss and their pulse rate was quite low, and they died a couple of times on the boss. Okay, that sounds about... So maybe it was just too hard, but not scary enough. Okay, we'll have to change that. Okay, their pulse rate is really, 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 really high here. Great, fantastic. Ah, I see. They keep dying on this part. And I have noticed the pattern that a lot of people die repeatedly on this boss, but I can tell that they're getting annoyed from their body language. Okay, so for the next iteration, we're going to have to change that. And in some ways, this could be good. For example, yes, it does allow developers to say, okay, here's what they did like, and here's what they didn't like about this game. And that does help. Because, let's face it, when you're crafting a game, developing a game, and designing a game, and by the way, I know what you're going to think, and those are tons of words that mean roughly the same thing, but they're not. Because when you're developing a game, you're basically going from the initial concept. When you're designing the game, you're designing it, to be fun. And sure, sometimes it's an iterative process. In other words, sometimes that you'll be like, okay, I really want to do X, but in reality, it doesn't work. It could be they didn't have enough console power to do it, and that is sometimes the case. It could be that they thought it was going to be cool, but in reality it just pisses you off when you're playing the section, and that's always a given. Sometimes things are great in theory, but in reality they're just not, and there have been tons of games that have worked like this. And other times, it can just be that they need to do small little tweaks. But they could actually use this data to improve things. However, here's the thing. I don't mind it in some ways. Like, for example, if it's a box that pops up when, you're first starting the game and said, hey, Capcom would like to... Just for example, I just use Capcom. I'm not saying they are doing this. I'll just use them purely as an example. There's been no mention of Capcom doing this. I'm just using it as an example. But let's say Capcom were to say, okay, for the next Resident Evil, let's go with Resident Evil 7 or something like that, or Resident Evil 8. We want to measure how well you do against certain bosses. And you're like, okay, fair enough. I don't mind. But here's the problem with this. Privacy right now is really crap. And I'll just be honest. Facebook is really one of those examples. Facebook is one of those examples where there are all these privacy concerns over Facebook. And honestly, I am completely computer literate. But at the same time, it's a pain in the ass to sort privacy out on Facebook. For example, let's say I want to add someone who I don't really know that well. Let's say I just met them at someone's party. And I don't think they're a serial killer or anything, but at the same time, I don't necessarily know them well enough to give them full access to my privacy. Say, for example, I have certain photos that I don't want them to have access to, or I have certain wall posts I don't want them to have access to, or I have certain data, for example, my cell phone number, or my email address, or whatever. You get the general gist. I don't want them to have access to that. It's not impossible to sort this stuff out. It's not. But it takes time to set up. And some of the options, they really confuse people. There are guides on the internet of how to sort the data out on Facebook. And the really annoying thing is for people that they keep changing it. And Facebook is something I'm just picking on. However, reality of the matter is, it's not just Facebook. It's a lot of it. And I know that a few people who are actually deactivating their Facebook accounts because of the privacy concerns. So I think it depends on just how they're going to do it, how easy it is to opt out, and your feelings on this. I really want them to clarify some of the stuff. This is another example of I just want more answers. And sometimes they're answering things, but they're not really telling you anything. It's it's a bit of a craft. But that isn't a downer on the console. Like, for example, we know now that there are going to be, Microsoft is spending $1 billion US dollars on games. And that is a fantastic number. We know that they're going to be focused heavily on E3. We also know that they're not just going to abandon the Xbox 360, which isn't a surprise. They didn't abandon the original Xbox when the Xbox 360 was launched. And it doesn't make sense to them to do that because they've already got a big install base for the Xbox 360. There's going to be 15 exclusive titles, of course, in the first 12 months. That's not fantastic, but it's more than one a month. And when you consider that one big hitting title a month, roughly, it's not shabby. As I keep saying, the real way to get people involved in your console isn't just to give them a better experience, as in, I don't know, this version of Xbox Live is better than PlayStation Network. Just for example, I'm not saying it is or anything like that before anyone jumps on me. But let's say it's just a little bit better. But if PlayStation had more exclusives, and by more I mean 6 or 7 more exclusives in the first year, just for example, and those exclusives were not just exclusive, but good exclusives, and that's a key word right there. I don't care how many exclusives you got, if they suck and they're consistently rating like 5 or 6 out of 10, and I take reviews as a pinch of salt. I read reviews, but I'm iffy about it. I do first impressions on this channel, as you guys know, and I'm even sometimes a bit hesitant to give you my opinion. I give you my opinion insofar as I say that I am enjoying it, or I see that there's frame rate bugs, or I see that X is a problem, or whatever. But when it comes to fun, it's really, really tricky to give accurate representations, especially when so many websites now are giving biased reviews. And I'm not saying that every website out there is giving biased reviews, because that's obviously a load of rubbish, and people, say that to scaremonger or whatever, but it's certainly becoming a bigger deal. Anyway, yeah, so let's see just what happens with the Xbox One. Microsoft have said that they are going to be addressing some of the DRM concerns. They said that we are listening, and by we, of course, they mean themselves. So I guess we'll just have to see what happens, what actually makes it to our living rooms at the end of the year. I think a lot of it is also going to depend heavily on Sony's response as well, because obviously, Microsoft are going to want to formulate a good plot. The bottom line is as well, they want to make money, and they are going to want to do so in a way that, makes them the most money. And in other words, if they say that, okay, we realize this is extremely unpopular with gamers, we think that we're going to lose 20% of, just for example, 20% of our audience minimum if we implement this stuff, they're going to want to tone it down at the very least, because it doesn't make sense not to. They're a business, and I can't blame them for it. As I've said before, I don't have in some ways, in a business sense, I don't have any problems with DRM because it makes sense to the business. Because let's say you've spent money on it, developing a game, you do not want that game being passed around to 15 people because, they're lending out a disc. So anyway, this has just been a bit of an all over the place video, as they tend to be the last couple of days. I will be, as I said, over the next couple of days, which will be tomorrow, which will be Saturday. I think that's the 1st of June. Bloody hell, how the hell is it already 1st of June? That's actually depressing on so many different levels. Will be being a lot more analytical, so there'll be a lot more tech stuff. It should have been today, but let's just say a few things got caught up. Anyway, I will see you guys soon. Take care, and bye for now.